This is lesson 2.1 out of the Ratios, Rates, and Statistics book. In my class, 2.1, I better start over on this side. 2.1 is on page 108. Lesson 2.1 is titled Fractions and Decimals. Sounds like we're going back to book 1, but I don't like the way that looks. But it's just, we're talking about fractions and decimals in a different way than we were earlier. Some of this is going to be kind of review, but we're taking it in a new direction with rates. All right, so warm up. And the warm-up here, we're talking about stuff we did last block with conversions. Convert 18 feet to yards. Number 2, simplify 16 over 24. And then the next ones are write each fraction as a decimal. All right, and they are 1/2, 1/4, and 3/4. These are all fractions. You should know by heart in your head what their decimal equivalents are. If you don't, I'd like you to get them memorized. 1/2, 1/4, and 3/4, and wouldn't be bad if you knew the estimates for 1/3 and 2/3 as well. Those should be in your head, so you don't even have to think of them. I always tell my students when we're dealing with 1/2 and quarters, think of quarters of a dollar. If you have 1 quarter, how many cents is that? 25 cents. So that's your decimal equivalent, and so on. Okay. All right. So my I can statement. I can convert fractions. I can convert fractions to decimals and decimals to fractions. Back and forth. That's what this lesson is about. All right. So I have 2 note slips that we're going to be using. One is writing a fraction as a decimal, one is writing a decimal as a fraction, and I want the fraction as the decimal to be first. All right, so if you want to fast forward while I glue these in, that would certainly be understandable. Writing a fraction as a decimal. I'm just going to do that one for right now. And highlight the title on that. Let's see, let's get that up in frame. There we go. Okay, so writing a fraction as a decimal is what we'll be talking about first. And to do that, we simply divide the numerator by the denominator. We've done this before. Hopefully this comes back to you pretty quickly. So let's write out some steps on how we do that. All right, to write a fraction as a decimal, the first thing that we would do, step number 1, is divide the numerator, and I'm going to use some abbreviation here, by the denominator. All right, and let's say we're working with this fraction of 3/10. I'm going to put it up here in this corner. All right. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is divide that numerator by the denominator. I have noticed that sometimes students get this backwards when they set up the division problem. We're not dividing 3 into 10. When we read this from top to bottom, it means 3 divided by 10. Okay, so we're dividing 10 into 3. So that would look like this. 10 dividing into 3. 3 divided by 10. All right? That's step 1 to set that up. Now, step 2 is to add decimal and 0. So what that means is I can't divide 10 into 3, right? 10's too big. But I can put a decimal here and a 0 here, and it doesn't change the value of this 3. Remember, anytime I put a decimal after a whole number and only add 0, it doesn't change the value of the 3. 3 and 0/10 is the same thing as 3. So, but what I can now do is think of this decimal problem as 10 divided into 30. And that I can do. But before I go any further, the first thing I need to do, and that's in step 3, is place decimal straight up and then divide as usual. Okay, so that means wherever that decimal is, which is in this case is right after the 3, I'm going to put it straight up into where my quotient will be. And you don't want to forget that part, or that'll change the answer completely. But now I'm going to think to myself, well, can 10 go into 3? No, it doesn't. So I'm just going to put a 0 there. It's really just a placeholder. 10 can go into 30. And it goes into 30 how many times? 3 times, right? So 3 times 10 is 30. 30 minus 30 is 0. So I have completed the problem. So in this case, 3/10 is equivalent to 3/10, right? This is the fraction way of writing 3/10 and the decimal way of writing 3/10. All right, so pretty simple problem there. Okay, but those are the 3 steps we'll carry out no matter what the fraction is for converting it to a decimal. All right, so now I'm going to take my light green pencil and I'm just going to kind of section this off right here so that we can talk about converting decimals into fractions. Alright, so I'll put this up high, give it a press, and highlight the title. Now we are going to be writing a decimal as a fraction. Okay, and the 3 steps for doing that are, first we determine the place value of the last number in the decimal, right? And we've done this before. And then 2, we will write a fraction using the decimal as the numerator and the place value as the denominator. So let's underline that. decimal as the numerator, place value as the denominator, right? That'll make more sense as we do the example. And then last, we check to see that the fraction is in its simplest form. It doesn't need to be simplified. All right, okay, so let's start out with the fraction 5 and 8/10. Okay, 5.8. We should say 5 and 8/10. All right, now step 1 says determine the place value of the last number in the decimal. Well, that would be this number right here. And what is its place value? Tenths. All right, now step 2 says to write this fraction using the decimal as the numerator and the place value as the denominator. All right, well, this is how that would look. We have 5, I'm going to do it like this, 5, and then what's after the decimal is our fraction. We wind up with a mixed number here. 5 and 8, the numerator is the decimal, that's an 8. And the denominator is the place value. It's in the tenths. So we have 5 and 8/10. All right. But now step 3 says we need to, oh wait, I'm going to write out my instructions here. So that means write as fraction for step 2. All right, so step 3 is to simplify this, and it does need simplifying. I have 5 and 8/10. 8/10 can be simplified down to 4/5, because 2 can go into 8 4 times, and 2 can go into 10 5 times, and now it's simplified as far as it can go. So simplify is our third step when we're converting a decimal, or writing a decimal as a fraction. Converting, writing, I guess, same thing. All right. Okay, so that's how that one works. Now, one last thing I wanted to make a note of down here at the very bottom is that if you have forgotten your decimal place values, your tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10,000ths, and so on, you have a place value chart is on page 2, lesson 1.1 of your notebook. It was one of the first things we did at the very beginning of our school year. So you can always look back at that place value. All right, so that's our, let's see if I can get the whole thing in there. Can I? Not quite, almost. Okay, so that's our notes for lesson 2.1. Let's go ahead and look at some practice problems. Okay, so practice problems for lessons 2.1. The first ones are simply converting each fraction into a decimal. Use your notes to figure out how that is done. And the second part is converting each decimal to a fraction. Again, you have examples in your notes for how this is done. Okay, so let's work these steps out and see how we do. All right, so convert each fraction each fraction into a decimal. So we need to do some division here. I've got to divide 1 by 8, or 8 into 1. So 8 divides into 1. Well, it doesn't, so that's where I put my decimal and my 0. I'm going to put my decimal straight up into the problem here. 8 does not go into 1. I'm going to put that 0 there, but 8 does go into 10 one time. 1 times 8 is 8. 10 subtract 8 is 2. I still don't have 0 here, so I'm going to add another 0 and bring it down. 8 goes into 20 2 times. 2 times 8 is 16. Subtract and I have 4. I still don't have a 0 here, so I'm going to put another one here and bring it down. 8 goes into 40 5 times. 5 times 8 is 40. And so now I have completed the problem. So 1/8 is, its decimal equivalent is 125 thousandths. I hope that's what you got too. All right, number 2, 7/10. All right, so its decimal equivalent. Now on this one, we can do the dividing here, and your teacher may require you to do it, but 7/10, if I understand how decimals are written, literally means 7/10. My 7 is in the tenths place. So I don't even have to do all that dividing to understand that 7/10 is 7/10. Again, I don't know, your teacher may require you to set this up as 10 divided into 7, put a decimal and get going there. But I don't. I kind of hope that you do recognize that that kind of work isn't necessary in that problem. Now, how is it when we have a mixed number? Well, with a mixed number, at first we ignore the whole number. What we want to do is figure out what is the decimal equivalent of this fraction. And to do that, we have to divide 3 by 5. So 5 goes into 3. Well, it doesn't. So we put down the decimal and the 0. 5 goes into 3 0 times. But 5 goes into 36 times. 6 times 5 is 30. And that leaves us with 0, so we've got it already. So our equivalent is, and now here's where we don't forget that whole number, 10 and, remember that decimal means and. 10 and 6/10. 10 and 6/10. We just tack on that decimal we found out of this fraction onto the whole number. 10 and 6/10. So we would read this as 10 and 3/5. Decimal equivalent of 3/5 is 6/10. So now it's 10 and 6/10. All right, so now, next step. Convert each decimal into a fraction. All right, so to do that, we first have to think of, okay, what is the place value of the last number of the decimal? All right, so this equals 6/10, because the 6 is in the tenths place. Now we have to think of, can that be simplified? And it sure can. 2 goes into 6 3 times, and 2 goes into 10 5 times. So now 3/5 is the fraction equivalent of 6/10 decimal. All right, so let's try that on this one. Okay, that last number there is in the hundredths place. So it's 15 hundredths. Can that be simplified? Yes, it can. And if you're not sure, can 15 go into 100 evenly? I'm not sure. Well, you know when you see 15 and 100 that certainly 5 can, so you can start with that, and then if you notice that it still isn't simplified, you can work it down again. But I happen to know that 5 goes into 15. I lost my train of thought here. Oh yeah, 3 times. Okay, and 5 goes into 100 20 times. So now as I look at 3 over 20, is there anything more I can do with that? No. So the fraction equivalent of the decimal 15 hundredths is 3 over 20. All right. Okay, so now we have what's going to become a mixed number. I know this because this number here in front of the decimal is going to be the whole number of my mixed number. So it's going to equal 10 and the 2 is in the tenths place. 10 and 2 tenths. But is that simplified? No. So I need to simplify it down to 10 and 1/5. 2 goes into itself once. 2 goes into 10 5 times. Okay, 10 and 1/5 is the decimal mixed number equivalent of the decimal 10 and 2 tenths. All right, last one. Same thing here. I can see I have a number in front of the decimal, so I know my fraction is going to be a mixed number. So I'm just going to put the 4 there and figure out what is this fraction. Well, this is in the hundredths place, so I know it's going to be 2 hundredths. Now, can 2 hundredths be simplified? Yes. 2 can go into itself 1 time, and 2 can go into 100 50 times. And so now I know that 4 and 2 hundredths has a fractional equivalent of 4 and 1 over 50. All right? Okay, so that's our practice problems. Hope you did well on that. I'll give you a peek at our worksheet for this one. All right, so the top ones, this is a matching, and let me get this up here so you can see more of them. So you're going to have to figure out, convert these fractions to decimals or the decimals to fractions and get them matched. Here's what I do not want you to do. Do not draw lines matching them across like that. Don't do that. It makes it hard to grade it. Make sure you're putting the letter on the line where it goes. Now, you have a choice here. You could decide that you want to convert all of these fractions to decimals and then find their matches. Or you can convert all of these decimals to fractions and find their matches. Or you can do a mix match, depending on what you're comfortable with. You may find it easier to convert one way or the other. And so if you do, then do that. I can tell you that there is one match for each one. None of them repeat, and all of them will be used. So so you can do it either way that makes you comfortable. Then down here, we have write each decimal as a fraction or mixed number in its simplest form. That's simply what we did right there in our notes and in our practice problems. So that shouldn't be a problem for you. This one I want you to pay special attention to what it says in the instructions. So it says determine which fraction is larger. It says rewrite as a decimal. And then it says compare the decimals. Now that matters. It's a little bit, it says determine which fraction is larger, but then it says compare the decimals. So here's what I'm telling you. You need to convert each one of these into a decimal. And then you need to set up a greater than or lesser than with those decimals. I find it confusing. Do you want my answer to be the fractions, or do you want my answer to be the decimals? In my class, I'm not going to care as long as you're setting it up as, because of this word compare, as long as you're setting it up as a greater than or less than symbol with either the fractions that are shown or their decimal equivalents. I hope that makes sense. Ask your teacher about that if it doesn't. Okay, so that leaves us with exit ticket for lesson 2.1. As always, I don't tell you how to do these. They're just for extra practice. I hope it looks pretty easy to you. We went over all these examples well. Okay, so hold on a second. Let me reach this. There we go. All right, so that is lesson 2.1 out of the Ratios, Rates, and Statistics book. Remember, the only way to learn math is to do math, and mistakes are proof that you're learning.